Kuskokwim River, Western Alaska. November 1903. The river is slowing. Every morning, the black current moves a little more like glass and a little less like water. The spruces along the bank wear collars of hoarfrost, and when men speak, their words hang in the air as steam before the wind erases them. On a shallow bend of that river, 32 prospectors are racing the season. You can hear it in the timberline. Axe, 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 curse, axe. The rhythm of men who know that once the last steamboat heads south, 7 months of isolation and killing cold begin. If you don't have walls and a roof by then, Alaska will teach you how small you are. Everyone on that bend knows this. Everyone except one man. At least that's how it looks. Where the others are dropping spruce and hemlock, he is unpacking canvas. Where they're squaring corners and setting sill logs, he's pacing a circle with long, deliberate strides. And where the proudest builders are arguing about whose walls will be thickest, he's hauling burlap sacks that clank like a blacksmith shop. "Guy's gone soft in the head," Tom Haller mutters, spitting into the frost. Haller's an ex-logger from Idaho and the de facto foreman of the little camp. "You don't winter up here in a circus tent." The other men laugh, relieved to have a target besides the weather. By February, those same men will be half exhausted, their cabins leaking heat like sieves, counting firewood piles with the anxiety of men counting weeks left to live. And that circus tent? It will be sitting at a comfortable 60 degrees inside, while the outside air hovers around 45 below, using barely a quarter of the firewood of the best cabins on the river. So what did this quiet mountain man understand about heat, wind, and snow that an entire camp of experienced frontiersmen had completely missed? Before we pick that apart, do me a favor. Hit the like button, subscribe if you're into Forgotten Frontier Engineering, and drop a comment telling me the coldest temperature you personally had to ride out. It puts what you're about to hear into perspective. All right, let's rewind to the day everyone decided Anders Lofgren had finally lost his mind. 1. The man everyone bet against Kuskokwim River, November 7th, 1903. The thermometer nailed to the trading post reads 26 degrees, right at that miserable spot where everything is wet and nothing is quite frozen. Snow comes down as slush. Boots sink. Gloves never dry. Tom Haller's crew has already cleared a patch of spruce and laid 3 heavy sill logs into a neat rectangle, 16 feet by 20. It's the same cabin footprint lumbermen have been stomping out from Michigan to Montana for 50 years. Familiar. Proven. Comforting. Downriver, Anders Lofgren is doing something nobody recognizes. He's tall, broad-shouldered in a way that suggests quiet strength rather than show. His beard is more frost than color. He doesn't talk much, which is reason enough for some men to distrust him. He walks a slow circle on a slight rise above the floodplain, counting out paces under his breath. Every few steps, he drives a sharpened willow pole into the sod with a wooden mallet. "Look at that," one of Haller's men says, pausing mid-swing. "He's planting a fence with no house." "Nah," another answers. "He's just marking where he wants to be buried." They laugh, because Alaska does that to people. If you don't laugh at someone else's bad odds, you have to think about your own. By sundown, Haller's cabin has 4 courses of logs, stacked and notched at the corners. Smoke curls from a temporary fire ring where the men boil coffee and warm their hands. By sundown, Anders has nothing standing higher than his waist, a ring of willow stakes, a shallow circular depression in the earth, 3 burlap sacks that ring with a dull metallic sound when he moves them. No one can tell yet that he is building a machine, not a shack. 2. Digging downward instead of building upward. Over the next week, the pattern becomes clearer. While the rest of the camp eats breakfast, Anders is already working with a short shovel, deepening his circular pit. The dirt he lifts out doesn't just get tossed aside. He piles it around the outer edge, packing it with his boots into a smooth berm. 18 inches down, then 20. Enough that when he stands at the bottom, the river wind barely touches his shoulders. Old Len McCrae, who's seen his share of winters from the Yukon to the Copper River, leans on his axe and watches. Digging his own grave, that one, he says. You open your floor to the earth. The cold comes up all winter. What Len doesn't know, and what Anders learned the hard way in a different hemisphere, is that a few feet down, the earth itself doesn't follow the wild swings of the air. In western Alaska, once you get below the top crust to freeze and thaw, the soil hovers in the low to mid-30s Fahrenheit almost all winter. It's cold, yes, but it's not minus 40. And more importantly, it barely changes while the air above is swinging through 100 degrees of difference. Anders is not inviting cold in. He is anchoring his shelter to something that doesn't care what the wind is doing. When the hole reaches the depth he wants, he lines the bottom with fresh-cut spruce boughs, needles up, making a springy mat that smells like a forest in June. On top of that, he spreads a thin layer of dry sand and fine soil, smoothing it with a board until the floor is firm, slightly spongy, and, most important, insulated from raw permafrost below. Only then does he start thinking about walls. 3. A frame that looks wrong to everyone else. The willow poles he drove earlier bend easily. He lashes their tops together into a ring, forming a cone. It's the geometry of a teepee, a Sami lavu, a Mongolian jeer, shapes refined in cold countries long before a single log cabin was ever raised in Idaho. To the men hauling heavy logs, it looks ridiculous. Where are you going to put your stove? Somebody calls. You got no corners to stack your junk in, another adds. You planning to live in a soup bowl? Anders ignores them. Over the willow skeleton, he pulls his first skin. Thick, oiled canvas, weather-stained but sound. He stretches it tight enough to shed snow and wind, but not so tight that it strangles the frame. He leaves a circular opening at the peak where the poles meet. Then he sets a second ring of lighter poles inside the first, anchored into the packed earth floor. This ring stands a few inches inward from the outer one. From a distance, it still looks like one structure. Up close, there are now two shells, an outer cone and an inner cone, with open space between. That space is the part nobody else notices, or understands, because that's where he's going to trap his best insulator, dead, unmoving air. 4. Wool, hides, and invisible walls. Late November brings the first real snow, not the half-hearted slush of earlier flurries, but dry powder that squeaks under boots and piles and crisp drifts against anything that breaks the wind. Most of the cabins now have 4 full walls and some kind of roof. Sod, poles, whatever the men could throw together. Smoke seeps from rough stone hearths. At night, the glow of their fires flickers through chinking gaps. Inside one of those cabins, the air near the fireplace reaches a toasty 60 degrees, but step away from the fire and the temperature drops brutally. Near the outer walls, frost creeps along the log seams. Men sleep with their backs to the room, faces toward the dying coals. Down in the pit on the rise, Anders pulls out his second layer. He's sewn together strips of wool blankets into big, crude panels. Ugly stitching, but strong. He hangs these panels from the inner pole ring, letting them drape almost to the floor. They don't touch the canvas. A space of about 2 inches separates them. Outer canvas. Gap of air. Inner wool. Already the structure is more sophisticated than any cabin on the river, but Anders isn't done. From another bundle he unrolls a heavy reindeer hides. The fur is long, dense, and impossible to mistake for anything but Arctic bread. Each hide has been cut and laced to form yet another set of wall panels. He hangs these on a third, even smaller ring of light poles, leaving another air gap between wool and fur. The hides fall, with the fur side turned inward toward where he'll actually live. From outside, you still see only canvas. Inside, there are now 3 distinct layers. Canvas, tough skin that takes the beating from wind and blowing ice. Wool, thick, forgiving insulator that still works when a bit damp. Fur, and inner, pelt filled with thousands of microscopic air pockets, acting as both insulation and radiant barrier. Between each layer, trapped air that doesn't move. Most of the men in camp grew up thinking of walls as a thing, wood, stone, whatever. To Anders, a wall is a system. The others are building single-thickness boxes that leak. He's building a multi-layer envelope that breathes where it wants and seals where it must. But none of that will matter if he can't figure out what to do with the heat once he makes it, which is where those stone-filled burlap sacks finally come into play. 5. Building a fire that doesn't waste itself. Every cabin on that bend has the same basic heating plan. Set a fire at one end of the room and hope the heat drifts across before it disappears up the chimney. It's simple, traditional, and brutally wasteful. An open hearth sends 70-80% of its heat right into the sky. The rest rises to the rafters, leaving the floor miserably cold. Anders doesn't want a fire that heats air. He wants a fire that charges stone. He starts by building a low circular wall from football-sized river rocks right at the center of his dugout floor. The wall stands about knee-high and forms a ring maybe 3.5 feet across. The rocks are fitted tight but not mortared. He wants gaps, small ones, for air to sneak through later. Inside that ring, he begins stacking the contents of his sacks, flat stones, each roughly the size of a dinner plate. He chooses the densest pieces he can lift, granite, basalt, some heavy sandstone. He stacks them like offset bricks, leaving narrow channels between the layers. The result looks like a crude stone oven without a roof. This is the heart of the shelter. 250 pounds of rock waiting to be turned into a slow-bleeding reservoir of heat. He lays a metal grate at the bottom of the ring and sets a short length of stovepipe above, rising toward the smoke hole at the peak. The pipe will carry smoke out when he burns hard. When he banks the fire, he'll cap it, forcing most of the remaining heat sideways into the stones instead of straight up and out. "Nice fire pit," Haller says one evening, squinting in from the entrance. "When the wind rips this canvas off, you can at least sit by that and die warm." Anders just nods. The less explaining he has to do, the better. He's learned that people don't really listen until the cold has humbled them. 6. First snow, first numbers. December 6th arrives with a hard blue sky and a wind with teeth. The trading post thermometer drops to 18 erg overnight, the coldest yet. In Haller's cabin, men wake in their blankets to find their hair rimed with frost, where it touched the outer logs. The water bucket on the far side of the room has a 1/4 inch of ice on top, despite the embers still glowing in the hearth. They shuffle into their boots, stamp life into their feet, and immediately feed the fire. Firewood disappears like breath in the wind. That same morning, Anders lights his stone ring properly for the first time. He lays a tight grid of dry spruce inside the circle, adds kindling, and sets it going with the smoke flap wide open. Flames lick the inner surfaces of the stones, turning them slowly from gray to sooty black to a faint, dull red deep in their cores. For 3 solid hours, he feeds that fire like a man paying into a bank account. By midday, the stones are too hot to touch. The little shelter feels almost oppressive, 80 degrees or more right next to the ring. Then Anders does the thing none of his neighbors would ever think to do. He lets the fire die. He rakes the coals into a shallow bed, adds a thin layer of ash, sets a flat stone lid over the ring, leaving a small opening at one side, and closes the smoke flap almost all the way. Just a sliver for any stray fumes to escape. Now, instead of a raging fire blasting heat up and out, he has a silent column of hot rock surrounded by still air and soft walls. That evening, after hours of chopping, Haller wanders down out of sheer curiosity. The cold has already etched fine lines of ice into his beard. He expects to step into a dim, freezing cave. Instead, his glasses fog. Inside, the little tent feels comfortable. Not tropical, not stifling, Just the kind of warmth where your shoulders drop and your fingers unclench. Maybe 50 degrees. Warm enough to take your mitts off for a while. Warm enough that his lungs don't hurt when he breathes. He glances at a small thermometer riding from the center pole. 49 degrees Fahrenheit, and slowly edging upward as the stones continue to release stored heat. How long since you fed the fire? Haller asks. 3 hours, maybe 4, Anders says. Don't need more until morning. Haller snorts. Wait till it hits 40 below. He leaves before Anders can answer. Pride, like cold, is something you don't shake quickly. 7. The killing cold snap. January 1904 brings the kind of weather old trappers talk about for decades. The river has vanished beneath solid white. Every sound is sharp. Axes strike with a ring like glass. Men move slower, not by choice but because the air itself fights them. On January 19th, the post thermometer officially bottoms out, 46 degrees in the shade, with an occasional gust that drives the effective chill past 50 degrees. Inside Haller's cabin, the picture is bleak. With the fire roaring and sucking air up the chimney, the air near the hearth hits a respectable 6 degree char. 10 feet away by the bunks, it's in the low 30s. A tin cup left on the floor near the outer wall forms a crust of frost around its base. They're burning wood like madmen, 60, 70 pounds every 7 or 8 hours, and still they can't push the far corners of the cabin into truly comfortable territory. At night, men take turns waking to feed the fire. If they don't, the place falls into the 20s before dawn. On the second morning of that cold spell, one of the younger prospectors, a kid named Owen from Nebraska, lies in his bunk watching his breath smoke in front of his face and thinks, Lofgren can't be alive in that tent. He pulls on his boots, stuffs a cheap pocket thermometer into his coat, and trudges down the slope. What he finds becomes camp legend. He ducks through the low entrance, blinks as his eyelashes thaw, and just stands there. No smoke stings his eyes. There is no raging blaze. The stone lid over the ring glows faintly orange along one edge, where a line of coals still breathes. But otherwise the fire is a memory. The air, though, feels like a different planet. Owen's face stops hurting. His nose runs instead of freezing. He pulls off one glove without thinking, and doesn't immediately regret it. A thermometer hangs from the center pole. He wipes the frost from its glass, squints, and laughs out loud. 62 degrees. Outside. 46 degrees. Inside the suicide tent. 22 degrees. A difference of 108 degrees. How much are you burning? He asks when he finds his voice. Anders shrugs and points to a modest stack of split spruce in the corner. Maybe 35 pounds a day, he says. 2-3 armloads. A few hours burn in the evening, sometimes a short one in the morning, if it was a hard wind. Owen stares. He knows Haller's cabin is chewing through well over 100 pounds a day. Tom needs to see this, he mutters. By supper, the whole camp has heard. 8. Pride walks through the flap. That evening, right after sunset, Tom Haller appears at the entrance, shoulders hunched more from stubbornness than from cold. He pushes the flap aside and steps in without asking. The shelter feels even warmer now, thanks to the evening charge Anders has just finished. The stones in the ring shimmer with deep, comfortable heat. A kettle of water sings quietly on a flat rock above a bed of coals. Haller stands in the center of the room, hands on his hips, turning slowly. He touches the inner fur wall. Warm. He presses a boot to the packed earth floor. Not freezing, not even particularly cold. He puts his palm close above the stone lid and pulls it back almost immediately. How long you run that fire? He asks. 2 hours hard, Anders says. Then I close the flap and let the rocks do the work. Smoke doesn't kill you. Draft keeps enough moving while it burns. After that, I open the flap a little if I cook. Simple. Haller pulls a pocket notebook, one of the few luxuries he carried north, and begins to jot figures. Outside temperature that afternoon, 42 degrees. Inside, when he stepped in, 50 degrees. Time since Anders started banking the fire, maybe 90 minutes. He asks Anders to tell him again how deep he dug, how many stone sacks he packed, what kind of rock he looked for. He scribbles endless notes while the Swede answers in short, patient sentences. Later, back at his own cold, smoky cabin, Howler sits up by the fire long after the others have crawled into blankets. He does more math. How many hours each man in camp is burning wood, how much weight they're hauling, how much of that heat goes into their houses versus up and out. Every number he writes makes his earlier contempt look stupid. The next morning he swallows hard and does the hardest thing a man like him can do. He asks for help. 9. Copycats, experiments, and real data. What happens over the next 6 weeks turns that little bend in the river into an accidental engineering lab. Howler goes first. He can't tear down his whole cabin, not in the middle of winter, so he adapts. With Anders helping, he rips out the huge open fireplace that was devouring fuel and replaces it with a scaled-down version of the stone ring tucked inside a small hearth at the cabin's center. They haul in 280 pounds of granite and dense river rock, build a circular core, and run stovepipe up through the old chimney throat. Instead of letting flames lick straight up the flue, they now wrap around the stones first. Howler also lines his interior walls with whatever layers he can scavenge. Old canvas tarps, spare blankets, even flattened burlap sacks. Each layer hangs a couple inches from the logs, creating imperfect but better than nothing air gaps. The results are immediate. Before the retrofit, his nighttime cabin temperature with a normal fire struggled to stay above 25 degrees away from the hearth. Afterward, with a few weeks of practice managing the fire and the draft, he's sleeping in 45 feet, 48 orgix air, with his wood use cut almost in half. It's not as efficient as Anders's dedicated design, but it's night and day better than what he had. Old Len McCrae tries a more modest version. He's too worn down to dig or haul tons of stone, so he does the low-hanging fruit. He hangs extra blankets on interior frames to create one good air gap. He builds a small stone bench beside his stove, letting it soak heat for hours, and then radiate it into the room after the fire dies. His temperatures rise by nearly 20 degrees. His woodpile starts shrinking slower. For the first time in years, he's not thinking constantly about whether he has enough fuel stashed for March. Other men improvise. One prospector makes a stone ring too big. It stores lots of heat, but takes so much wood to charge that the gains don't pencil out. Another uses shale, which cracks loudly the first time he runs a hot fire and sends chips flying like shrapnel. Each failure teaches something. Optimal stone mass for a shelter the size of Anders's tent seems to fall between 180 and 240 pounds. Stones must be dense and tough, granite, basalt, hard sandstone, otherwise they spall and crumble under repeated heating cycles. Air gaps of around 1.5 to 2 inches between layers give the best balance between insulation and wasted space. By mid-February, what started as ridicule has turned into a quiet revolution. Across the camp, average nightly wood use has dropped by an estimated 40%. Cases of frostbite and frozen lung coughing fits have almost disappeared. Men who used to spend 6 hours a day cutting wood now get by with 2 or 3, and can put the extra time into actual prospecting, equipment repair, or simply sleeping like humans instead of stoking machines. One trader with a taste for notes starts calling Anders's place the Hot Tent, and the name sticks. Letters that leave on the first southbound boat in spring all mention it in one way or another. 10. Let's talk physics without the equations headache. Time to zoom out for a minute and look at why this thing works so well. If you're still watching, hit that like button. This is the part where we translate a century-old story into principles you could apply today if you ever find yourself staring down a hard winter off-grid. 10. 1. Thermal mass versus leaky boxes. Most cabins on that river were basically leaky wooden boxes, single thickness log walls, gaps at the corners and between settling logs, a fireplace at one end that blows hot air up a chimney as fast as you can feed it wood. Heat rises, finds the chimney, escapes. Cold air sneaks in through every crack to replace it. Your fire is mostly heating the sky. The stone ring in Anders' tent flips that script. Stone has thermal mass, the ability to store a lot of heat energy when you raise its temperature. Dense rock can hold several times more energy per cubic foot than wood or air. By burning a hot, efficient fire for a few hours and letting those 200-plus pounds of stone soak up energy, Anders builds a heat battery. Once he banks the fire and closes the vent, almost all that stored energy can go only one place, back into the room slowly through radiation and conduction. Instead of fighting constant heat loss with constant burning, he front-loads the work and coasts. Tent-bonku insulation is mostly about air that doesn't move. The triple-layer wall system is just as important. Canvas alone is not a great insulator. Wool alone is decent, fur alone is decent, but canvas plus air gap plus wool plus air gap plus fur are something far better than the sum of its parts. Why? Because dead air, air that isn't allowed to circulate, is a fantastic insulator. It has very low thermal conductivity, especially when trapped in small pockets. Think of Anders' wall like this. The canvas takes the beating from wind, snow, and the occasional flying debris. The first air gap behind it slows down any heat trying to leave. The wool adds resistance and handles moisture, so condensation doesn't soak everything else. A second air gap slows things again. The fur layer, with all its micro pockets, acts like a high-end parka, keeping warm air near the living space and reflecting heat inward, compared to a log wall with cracks and no intentional air gaps. The effective insulation value of this system is at least double, maybe more. 10.3 geometry matters more than you think. Shape plays a huge role. A circle encloses the maximum area with the minimum perimeter. That means for the same floor space, a round shelter has less wall area for heat to leak through than a rectangle. The conical roof also reduces the surface area exposed to the cold sky compared to a big flat expanse. And since hot air naturally rises to the peak, Anders can manage his internal climate by tweaking a single smoke flap. A little opening for draft while the fire is burning, almost closed when he's running purely on stored heat. A rectangular cabin with a tall chimney doesn't have that kind of control. You either vent hard and lose heat, or you vent little and risk smoke. There's not much middle ground. 10.4 Earth as a silent partner, digging down into the ground and bunding earth up around the outside, does two underrated things. It couples the shelter to the Earth's more stable temperature, so the floor never gets as brutally cold as the air. That's why Anders' floor stays in the mid-30s, even when the air outside is in the -40s. It takes the worst edge off the wind. Since the berm rises to mid-wall height, the fiercest gusts skim over rather than digging under the structure, cutting one of the biggest paths of convective heat loss. When you add all of this together, thermal mass, layered dead air insulation, efficient geometry, and earth coupling, you get that impossible result. A shelter staying 60 degrees inside while it's 40+ below outside, burning a fraction of the wood, no magic. Just physics applied with patience instead of pride. 11. What happened after the river thawed? When the Kuskokwim finally loosens its grip and clotted flows begin to grind downstream, the men in camp tally their winter. Some have done well, some have barely hung on. A few pack their gear and head south the first chance they get, swearing never to gamble with northern winters again. But everyone leaves with stories. Haller writes in his notebook and sends copies and letters to friends working claims near Nome and Dawson. One Swede here dug down, built a round tent with 3 skins and a stone belly. I laughed when he started. By February, he was sleeping in his shirt while my boys took turns feeding the stove so we didn't freeze stiff. If you go north, Find the people who already live there and ask how they stay warm. Don't assume Michigan cabins belong on the Yukon. Old Len tells his nephews about the winter the tent beat the cabins. Owen, the kid from Nebraska, goes home a few years later and builds a round stone core smokehouse for his farm, copying what he saw in miniature. As for Anders, the records blur. His name pops up in a trapper's ledger near Bristol Bay 2 winters later. After that, he vanishes into the white noise of history. One more man who carried his knowledge in his head and hands rather than in blueprints. But the idea he left behind doesn't vanish. Mining camps hear about hot tents and stone bellies. Some experiment, some fail. A few trading posts ahead of their time adopt similar systems, cutting their firewood use enough to make staying open through winter practical instead of punishing. By the 1920s, cheap sawn lumber and factory stoves push most of those hybrid designs aside. It's easier to order fiberglass rolls and oil drum stoves than to haul stone and sew wool. Modern building science eventually rediscovers every principle Anders used: thermal mass for storage, air gap insulation, compact shapes for lower loss, and earth coupling for stability. Engineers write papers. Architects build passive solar homes and call them innovative. A Sami grandmother watching one of those glossy documentaries would probably just nod and say, "We knew that." 12. The quiet lesson most people miss. It's tempting to tell this as a genius mountain man story. One clever Swede outsmarting a camp full of stubborn Americans. But that version misses the most important point. Anders Lofgren didn't invent any of this. The conical, layered tent. Sami Lavu designs had been using similar geometry and skin-on-skin layering for centuries. The hot stone core? Variants appear in Siberian winter huts, Finnish masonry ovens, Korean ondol floors, and Russian pechka stoves. Digging down and berming up? Indigenous builders from Alaska to the Eurasian Arctic had long been using semi-subterranean houses to tame the most violent swings in surface temperature. What Anders did was something rarer than raw invention. He paid attention. He moved through different worlds, Scandinavian fishing villages, Siberian camps, North American trap lines, and instead of dismissing local ways as backward, he treated them like field-tested engineering. He watched what worked in places where failure meant death, not inconvenience. He asked questions. He remembered details. And when he found himself on a river bend staring at his first real Alaskan winter, he stitched those lessons together into something that fit his tools, his materials, and his needs. The men who laughed at him weren't stupid. They were just trapped inside the invisible walls of their own tradition. To them, a real house had